The blood on her knuckles had dried brown by the time Victoria Harlow stumbled into the saloon at noon. Her hands trembling so badly she could barely push open the swinging doors. She had scrubbed laundry for 14 hours straight in the scorching Texas heat, her fingers raw from lye soap and her back screaming from bending over the washboard. And all she wanted was one glass of water before she walked the 3 miles back to the boarding house where she rented a corner of a room she shared with 2 other women. The year was 1878, and Austin had grown into a bustling city of nearly 10,000 souls, most of them trying to scrape together enough money to eat, just like her. She never expected to find him there, sitting alone at a corner table with a whiskey he was not drinking, his hat pulled low over his eyes like he was trying to disappear into the shadows. Pierce Dalton looked up when she walked in, and something in his expression shifted when he saw her hands. She did not know him then, had only seen him around town a few times, always keeping to himself, always moving through the streets like a man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. He was a cowboy who had just come back from a cattle drive that had taken him all the way to Kansas, his pockets finally heavy with pay, his body exhausted from months on the trail. Victoria made it to the bar and asked for water in a voice that came out more like a croak. The bartender, a grizzled man named Sullivan, poured her a glass without comment, used to seeing working women come through his doors looking half dead. She drank it down in 3 gulps, feeling the cool liquid soothe her parched throat, and was about to leave when she heard boots on the wooden floor behind her. "Let me buy you something to eat," Pierce said quietly, and when she turned to look at him, she saw concern in his blue eyes, genuine and unguarded. "You look like you have not had a proper meal in days." She wanted to refuse out of pride, wanted to tell him she did not need charity from a stranger, but her stomach chose that moment to growl so loudly that Pierce actually flinched. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment, but he just gestured toward his table, his expression kind rather than pitying. "I have been where you are," he said simply. "Please." So she followed him to that corner table, sinking into the chair like her bones had turned to water, and when Sullivan brought over a plate of beef stew and fresh bread, she had to force herself not to cry at the sight of it. Pierce did not watch her eat, did not make her feel like some starving animal on display. He just sipped his whiskey slowly and looked out the window at the dusty street, giving her privacy in her hunger. "What is your name?" he asked after she had eaten half the bowl, her desperation finally easing enough for her to slow down. "Victoria Harlow," she said, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand before remembering her manners. "I do laundry for Mrs. Henderson. She runs the big house on 6th Street. "I know the place," Pierce said, his jaw tightening. "She is known for working her girls until they drop." "It is honest work," Victoria said defensively, even though she knew he was right. "Mrs. Henderson paid barely enough to keep body and soul together, and she expected her laundresses to work from dawn until well past dark, 6 days a week. Victoria had been doing it for 3 years, ever since she arrived in Austin with nothing but the clothes on her back and a determination to make her own way in the world. She was 22 years old and felt 40, her youth burning away in steam and soap suds. Pierce leaned forward then, and before she could pull away, he reached across the table and took one of her hands in both of his. His palms were calloused too, rough from years of roping cattle and handling reins, but his touch was impossibly gentle as he turned her hand over to examine the damage. The knuckles were split and bleeding in places, bruised purple and yellow in others. Her fingers were swollen, the nails broken down to the quick. Scars from old burns crisscrossed her wrists where she had been careless with the boiling water. "These hands have seen too much pain," he said softly. And then, to To her absolute shock, he lifted her hand to his mouth and pressed a kiss to each bruised knuckle, so tender it made her breath catch in her throat. "I swear to you, Victoria Harlow, that if you let me, I will make sure you never have to work like this again. I will give you rest." She pulled her hand back, her heart hammering against her ribs, not from fear but from something she could not quite name. "You do not even know me," she whispered. "Why would you say such a thing?" Pierce sat back, and for a moment she thought she saw pain flash across his face, old and deep. "I had a sister once," he said quietly. "She worked herself to death in a factory back in Missouri. I was too young to help her, too powerless to change anything. By the time I was old enough to make real money, she was already gone. I made a promise at her grave that I would never stand by and watch another woman destroy herself with labor if I could do something about it." Victoria felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. She could not afford to cry, could not afford to be soft. "I am not your responsibility," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Maybe not," Pierce agreed, "but I would like the chance to know you, to see if maybe we could help each other." She should have said no. She should have walked away from this stranger with his intense eyes and his impossible promises. But there was something in his face that made her want to trust him, something honest and raw that she had not seen in any of the other men who passed through her life. So instead of leaving, she stayed, and they talked as the afternoon sunlight slanted through the dusty windows, and the saloon slowly filled with the evening crowd. Pierce told her about growing up in Missouri, about watching his father drink himself to death after his mother died of cholera. He told her about his sister Sarah, who had been just 16 when she started working at the textile mill, who had lasted only 3 years before her lungs gave out from breathing in cotton dust day after day. He told her about heading west at 18 with nothing but grief and anger, about learning the cowboy trade from an old rancher who took pity on him, about the years he had spent moving from ranch to ranch, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. Victoria, in turn, told him about growing up in a small town outside of Houston, about her father who drank away every penny they had, about her mother who died trying to give birth to a baby that never drew breath. She told him about running away at 19, when her father tried to marry her off to a man 3 times her age to settle a gambling debt. She told him about the long, terrifying journey to Austin on foot, about the kindness of strangers who gave her rides in their wagons, about the overwhelming relief she felt when she finally arrived in the city and found work, even if that work was slowly killing her. By the time the sun had set completely and the saloon was thick with cigarette smoke and laughter, they had talked for hours, and Victoria felt something loosening in her chest, some tight knot of loneliness she had carried for so long she had forgotten it was there. When Pierce finally walked her back to her boarding house, the streets dark and dangerous, she felt safer than she had in years. "Can I see you again?" he asked when they reached her door, his hat in his hands, twisting it nervously like a boy asking a girl to dance for the first time. "Yes," Victoria said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. Over the next few weeks, Pierce courted her with a determination that was both flattering and slightly overwhelming. He met her every day after she finished her work, often bringing food so she would not have to cook, sometimes just sitting with her in the small park near the boarding house and talking until the stars came out. He never tried to kiss her, never pushed for anything more than conversation and companionship, but Victoria found herself falling for him anyway, slowly and then all at once. He was different from any man she had ever known. He listened when she spoke, really listened, his full attention on her like she was the most important person in the world. He made her laugh with stories about ornery cattle and stubborn horses. He was thoughtful, bringing her a jar of salve for her hands that he had bought from the apothecary, showing her how to massage it into her skin to help the bruises heal. And he was honest about his past, about his mistakes and regrets, never pretending to be anything more than what he was. One evening, about a month after they first met, Pierce arrived at her boarding house with his horse saddled and ready. "Come with me," he said, his eyes bright with excitement. "I want to show you something." She was exhausted from another long day of work, but something in his expression made her agree. She climbed up behind him on the horse, wrapping her arms around his waist, feeling the solid warmth of him through his shirt. They rode out of the city as twilight fell, heading west along the Colorado River, until they reached a place where the land opened up into rolling hills covered in wildflowers. Pierce helped her down from the horse and led her to the top of a small rise, and from there she could see for miles in every direction. The sky was streaked with pink and gold from the setting sun, and the air smelled like grass and earth and possibility. "I bought this land last week," Pierce said, his voice thick with emotion. 300 acres. It is not much, but it is enough to start a ranch. I have been saving for years, working every cattle drive I could, living cheap and putting away every dollar. And now, I finally have enough to build something real, something lasting." Victoria looked at him, her heart in her throat, understanding what he was really saying even before he spoke the words. "I want to build it with you," Pierce said, turning to face her fully, taking both her damaged hands in his. "I know we have not known each other long, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. Marry me, Victoria. Let me give you the rest I promised. Let me spend every day of my life making sure you never have to hurt like this again." She should have been cautious. She should have asked for more time, for proof that his feelings were real and lasting. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw her future reflected back at her, and it was bright and beautiful and full of hope. "Yes," she said, and then she kissed him for the first time, standing on that hilltop with the Texas sunset painting the world in shades of gold, and she felt something inside her that had been broken for years finally start to heal. They were married 2 weeks later by a justice of the peace in Austin, with Sullivan the bartender and one of Victoria's roommates standing as witnesses. Victoria wore a simple blue dress she had mended 3 times, and Pierce wore his only suit, and neither of them cared that it was not fancy because the love between them was real and true. And that was all that mattered. Mrs. Henderson was furious when Victoria gave her notice, threatening to blacklist her from ever working in Austin again. But Pierce just put his arm around Victoria's shoulders and told the old woman that his wife would not be needing employment. "Thank you very much." And Victoria felt a fierce joy at walking away from that place for the last time. The first months of their marriage were hard in ways Victoria had not expected. Pierce had enough money to buy the land and some basic supplies, but building a ranch from nothing required more work than either of them had anticipated. They lived in a tent while Pierce built a small cabin, working from sunrise to sunset cutting timber and hauling stones. Victoria helped as much as she could, but Pierce was careful not to let her overwork herself, always mindful of her healing hands. She learned to cook over an open fire, to tend the small garden she planted near the tent, to care for the 3 cows and dozen chickens Pierce bought from a neighbor. Her hands, given time to heal with the salve and rest, slowly began to look less like the hands of someone twice her age. The bruises faded, the cuts healed and new calluses formed, but these were different, earned from building something of her own rather than enriching someone else. Pierce was a patient teacher, showing her how to milk the cows, how to collect eggs without scaring the hens, how to identify which plants were good for eating and which would make her sick. He worked himself hard, but never so hard that he did not have energy left for her at the end of the day. They would sit together outside the tent, watching the stars come out, and he would hold her hand and tell her about his dreams for the ranch, about the cattle he wanted to buy, about the family he hoped they would have someday. "I want sons and daughters who never know what it is like to go hungry," he said one night, his arm around her shoulders as she leaned against him. "I want them to grow up free and wild and happy." "How many children are we having in this dream of yours?" Victoria asked, laughing softly. "As many as you will give me," Pierce said, kissing the top of her head. "But only if you want them. You have suffered enough, Victoria. I will never ask you to sacrifice yourself for me or anyone else." She turned in his arms and kissed him properly, pouring all her love and gratitude into it. "I want them too," she whispered against his mouth. "I want to fill this ranch with life and love and laughter." By the time winter arrived, the cabin was finished. It was small, just 2 rooms and a loft, but it was solid and warm and theirs. Pierce had built the furniture himself, crafting a bed frame from pine and a table from oak. Victoria made curtains from flour sacks and braided rugs from scraps of fabric she bought cheap in town. It was not much, but when she stood in the doorway and looked at what they had created together, she felt richer than she had ever imagined possible. That winter was harsh, with ice storms that kept them trapped inside for days at a time, but Victoria did not mind. She and Pierce spent those long evenings playing cards, reading aloud from the few books they owned, and making love by the firelight. She learned every inch of his body, every scar and every story behind them. He was gentle with her always, treating her like she was precious, and she bloomed under his care like a flower finally given water after a long drought. In the spring, Pierce bought his first herd of cattle, 20 head that he drove back to the ranch with the help of a neighbor. Victoria watched him work, his body strong and capable, and felt a fierce pride in this man who had chosen her, who had seen her at her lowest point and decided she was worth saving. The ranch grew slowly but steadily. Pierce hired 2 cowboys to help with the cattle, young men named Tommy and Frank who were hard workers and respectful. Victoria learned to cook for the crew, making huge pots of stew and beans, baking bread in the oven Pierce had built into the fireplace. Her hands, though still bearing the scars of her past, were strong now, capable of kneading dough and wringing out laundry without the pain that had once defined her existence. She was happy in a way she had never thought possible. Every morning she woke up next to Pierce, feeling his warm body beside hers, and thanked God for the chance encounter that had changed her life. Every evening they sat together on the porch Pierce had added to the cabin, watching the sun set over their land, and she marveled at how far they had come. One morning in late summer, Victoria woke up feeling nauseated. She barely made it outside before she was sick, heaving into the bushes while Pierce held her hair back and rubbed her back soothingly. When it happened again the next day and the day after that, they both knew what it meant. "We are going to have a baby," Victoria said, her hand on her still flat stomach, her eyes wide with wonder and fear. Pierce let out a whoop of joy and picked her up, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to put her down before she was sick again. He set her down carefully, his hands cupping her face, his eyes shining with tears. "I am going to take care of you," he promised. "Both of you, you will want for nothing, I swear it," and he kept that promise. As Victoria's belly grew, Pierce hired a woman from town to help with the heavy housework. He bought her a rocking chair and placed it on the porch where she could sit and sew baby clothes while watching the ranch operate around her. He was attentive to her every need, fetching her water when she was thirsty, making sure she ate even when the nausea made food unappealing, holding her when the fear of childbirth made her cry in the middle of the night. "Women die in childbirth," she whispered one night, her voice small and scared. "What if I die and leave you alone?" "You will not die," Pierce said fiercely, holding her tight. "I will not let you, and I am getting the best midwife in Austin to be here when the time comes. You are going to be fine, Victoria. I promise you." The baby came in early spring, during a thunderstorm that shook the cabin and made the cattle low nervously in the fields. The midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Chen who had delivered hundreds of babies, arrived just in time. The labor was long and painful, lasting through the night and into the next morning, and there were moments when Victoria thought she might actually die. Moments when the pain was so intense she could not imagine surviving it. But Pierce never left her side. He held her hand and let her squeeze until she thought she might break his fingers. He wiped her forehead with cool cloths and told her she was strong, that she could do this, that he loved her more than life itself. And when the baby finally came, slipping into the world with a lusty cry that announced his arrival, Victoria looked into her husband's tear-streaked face and knew that everything they had been through had been worth it for this moment. "A son, Mrs. Chen said, placing the squalling infant on Victoria's chest. "A healthy, strong son." They named him Patrick, after Pierce's father, whose name had been the same before the drink had destroyed him. Pierce held his son with shaking hands, his face full of such love and wonder that Victoria felt tears streaming down her own cheeks. "He will have a better life than I did," Pierce said softly. "He will grow up knowing he is loved and wanted. He will never have to watch his mother work herself to death or his father drown in a bottle. I swear it, Victoria. I swear it on my life." Patrick was an easy baby, nursing well and sleeping in long stretches that allowed Victoria to recover from the birth. Pierce was a devoted father, changing diapers without complaint and walking the floor with the baby when he was fussy so Victoria could rest. The Cowboys, Tommy and Frank, were utterly charmed by the infant, bringing him little carved toys and making faces to make him smile. The ranch continued to prosper. Pierce's careful management and hard work paid off as the herd grew and the profits increased. He hired more help, expanding the operation, but he never forgot his promise to Victoria. She worked because she wanted to, not because she had to. And if she was tired or the baby needed her, Pierce never made her feel guilty for stepping back. By the time Patrick was 2 years old, toddling around the ranch and getting into everything, Victoria discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect, and when their daughter Margaret was born on a clear autumn day, the whole family rejoiced. Margaret had Victoria's dark hair and Pierce's blue eyes, and she was a spirited child from the start, demanding attention and refusing to be ignored. Patrick, now old enough to understand he had a sister, was fascinated by the baby, always wanting to help feed her and rock her cradle. The years passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. The ranch grew into one of the most successful in the area, with Pierce's reputation for fair dealing and quality cattle spreading throughout Texas. They added rooms to the cabin, turning it into a proper house with glass windows and a real wood floor. Victoria planted roses by the front door and fruit trees in the yard. She kept chickens and sold eggs in town, not because they needed the money, but because she enjoyed having something that was entirely hers. Patrick grew into a strong, intelligent boy who loved working alongside his father, learning everything Pierce could teach him about ranching. Margaret was wild and free, climbing trees and riding horses almost before she could walk. When she was 3, Victoria had another son whom they named Daniel, and 2 years after that, twin girls arrived, Alice and Emma, completing their family. The house was always full of noise and laughter. Victoria spent her days cooking and cleaning and mending clothes, but it was different from the work she had done at Mrs. Henderson's. This work was for her family, for people she loved, and it filled her with satisfaction rather than draining her. Her hands, though still bearing the scars of her past, were no longer bruised and bleeding. They were the hands of a rancher's wife, capable and strong, hands that kneaded bread and sewed clothes and braided her daughter's hair. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were all in bed and she and Pierce sat together on the porch, she would look at her hands in the lamplight and remember that day in the saloon when he had kissed each bruised knuckle and sworn to give her rest. He had kept that promise, and so much more. He had given her a life beyond her wildest dreams, a home filled with love, children who would never know the kind of grinding poverty she had endured. "What are you thinking about?" Pierce asked one evening, noticing the tears in her eyes. "I am thinking about how lucky I am," Victoria said softly. "I am thinking about the day you walked into that saloon and changed my life. I am thinking about how close I came to never knowing any of this." Pierce took her hand, the one with the faint scars still visible across the knuckles, and lifted it to his lips. He kissed each knuckle, just as he had done that first day, his touch reverent and tender. "I am the lucky one," he said. "You gave me a reason to build something lasting. You gave me a family and a purpose. Everything I have, everything I am is because of you." They sat together in the gathering darkness, hands entwined, watching the stars come out over their land. Inside the house, their children slept safely, dreaming whatever dreams children dream. The cattle grazed peacefully in the fields. The ranch, built from nothing but determination and love, stood solid and prosperous. Victoria thought about the young woman she had been, stumbling into that saloon with bleeding hands and an empty stomach, thinking that life would never be anything but pain and exhaustion. She thought about how one moment of kindness, one man seeing her suffering and deciding to do something about it, had transformed everything. "I love you," she said to Pierce, the words inadequate to express the depth of her feelings but the only one she had. "I love you too," Pierce replied. Always and forever. As the years continued to roll by, the Dalton Ranch became a fixture in the Austin area. Patrick, when he turned 18, began taking on more responsibilities, proving himself a capable rancher in his own right. He had inherited his father's work ethic and his mother's kindness, and everyone who met him predicted great things for the young man. Margaret, true to her spirited nature, announced at 16 that she wanted to become a teacher. Pierce and Victoria supported her dream, sending her to the new teachers' college that had opened in Austin. She returned home with her certificate and opened a small schoolhouse on the ranch, teaching not just her younger siblings, but also the children of the ranch hands and neighboring families. Daniel showed an aptitude for horses, training them with a patience and skill that amazed everyone. By the time he was 20, people were bringing horses from all over Texas for him to work with. The twin girls, Alice and Emma, though identical in appearance, had different interests. Alice loved to cook and spent hours in the kitchen with Victoria, learning to make everything from simple bread to elaborate cakes. Emma loved the land itself, studying the plants and animals, always bringing home interesting rocks or unusual flowers to examine. Pierce, now in his 50s with silver threading through his dark hair, remained as devoted to Victoria as he had been the day he first kissed her scarred knuckles. He had kept every promise he made to her, giving her a life of comfort and love, ensuring that she never again had to work until her hands bled and her body broke. One afternoon, when Victoria was 50 years old, her hair now more gray than brown. She sat in her rocking chair on the porch and watched her family gathered in the yard. Patrick was teaching his own young son to rope a fence post. Margaret was reading to a group of children under the shade of an oak tree. Daniel was in the corral, working with a beautiful black mare. The twins were helping Pierce repair a section of fence, all of them laughing at something Emma had said. Victoria looked down at her hands, resting peacefully in her lap. The scars were still there, faint but visible, reminders of a past that felt like it belonged to someone else. These hands had known brutal labor and constant pain, but they had also known love and gentleness. They had held her babies, cooked meals for her family, planted gardens and sewn clothes and done 1,000 small acts of care. She remembered that desperate young woman who had walked into a saloon just wanting a glass of water, who had been so broken down by life that a simple meal had nearly made her cry. She remembered Pierce's face when he first saw her damaged hands, the compassion and determination in his eyes. She remembered that first kiss on her bruised knuckles, the promise he had made that seemed too impossible to believe, but he had kept that promise. He had given her rest, but more than that, he had given her a life worth living. He had seen her when she was at her lowest point and had chosen to love her, to lift her up, to build a future with her. And together, they had created something beautiful, a family and a home filled with love and laughter and hope. Pierce walked over to the porch, leaving the twins to finish the fence repair. He climbed the steps and sat down in the chair next to hers, taking her hand in his just as he had done countless times over the past 30 years. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his blue eyes still as bright as they had been when he was 25. "I am thinking about how grateful I am," Victoria said, squeezing his hand. "I am thinking about all the years we have had together, all the children we have raised, all the love we have shared. I am thinking about how one act of kindness in a dusty saloon changed the course of my entire life." Pierce lifted her hand to his lips and kissed each knuckle, a gesture that had become a ritual between them, a reminder of where they started and how far they had come. "You changed my life too," he said softly. "You gave me purpose and joy. You made me a better man. Every day with you has been a gift, Victoria. Every single day." As the sun began to set over the ranch, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Victoria Dalton looked at her husband and smiled. Her hands, once bruised and bleeding from years of labor, now rested peacefully in his, warm and safe and loved. She had found her rest and so much more. She had found home,